Today, I will tell you a very fascinating story that happened to me, and you subscribe to the channel. This will give me inspiration for further work and development of the channel. I had always dreamed of living alone, a place of my own, no hustle and bustle, no roommates, just peace and comfort. When I was offered to rent an old but spacious apartment in the city center at an amazingly low price, I didn't think twice. Of course, the condition wasn't ideal. Creaky floors, old walls with peeling paint, slightly worn-out wallpaper. But it didn't bother me. The most important thing was freedom and personal space. The first few days passed peacefully. I settled and unpacked my things, getting used to the new place. The building I had moved into was old, constructed in the mid-20th century, and there was a strange atmosphere in it. I can't say it was ominous, just unusual, as if the shadows of the past had frozen in the air. On the very first night, I noticed something strange. I lay down in bed, turned off the light, and as soon as I began to fall asleep, I thought I heard a faint rustling in the corner of the room. I froze and listened. Silence. I decided it was just the old house creaking, maybe mice or the wind blowing through the cracks. But there was something in the sound that made me uneasy. The next night, something even stranger happened. Waking up in the middle of the night, I heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound, as if someone was whispering softly. I sat up, my heart racing. The sound was coming from somewhere in the hallway. I slowly got out of bed, turned on the light, and walked into the hallway. No one was there, just silence and the feeling that someone had just been there. At first, I tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe the sound was coming from the neighbors, or perhaps I was just too tired and imagined it. But the longer I stayed in the apartment, the stronger the feeling grew that I wasn't alone here. From the first days in this apartment, I felt strange, an unsettling feeling as if someone was nearby, a presence that couldn't be explained. But even with this, I continued living my usual life, convincing myself that all these sensations were just figments of my imagination. But one day, something happened that made me believe there was indeed something wrong with this place. That night, I woke up from a sudden chill. It felt as though the room had suddenly become freezing, even though the heating was working fine and there was no significant drop in temperature outside. I sat up in bed, bewilderedly looking around. There was a faint scent of baby powder in the air. This smell seemed odd, since there was nothing like that in my apartment. I grabbed my phone to check the time. It was 3:12 a.m. It was at that moment that I heard it. A quiet voice, almost a whisper, but clearly audible. "Can you hear me?" I froze. My heart clenched with fear. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I had imagined it. But then the voice came again, this time closer. "You can hear me." I felt cold sweat running down my back. There was no one in the room. I turned on the light, quickly checked all the corners, but of course, no one was there. Yet the feeling of an unseen presence grew even stronger. I decided to check the door. The lock was secure, the windows were locked. No signs of intrusion. I returned to bed, but I couldn't fall asleep. I felt that I wasn't alone in the apartment. And now it wasn't just a feeling, it was a reality. The next morning, I tried to find a reasonable explanation. Maybe I had heard the neighbors, perhaps it was a draft. But none of the explanations seemed convincing enough. I decided to look into the history of the apartment and went to the archive. What I found out made me regret my decision to stay here. I spent the day in the archive, trying to find any information about the house I was living in. Old newspapers, yellow documents, official reports. I flipped through the pages, not really knowing what I was looking for. But the deeper I delved, the more my hands began to shake. The house I had moved into once belonged to a family. A husband, a wife, and their little daughter. It seemed like an ordinary story. But what unsettled me was that in 1987, the family disappeared without a trace. They were never found. The apartment remained vacant for several years, and then the house was put up for sale again. No one wanted to live there. People said that at night, strange sounds came from the apartment. A child's cry, footsteps, creaking floorboards. As I was heading home, the echoes of old newspaper articles rang in my head. I didn't want to believe that my apartment was connected to this tragedy. But as soon as I stepped through the door, that faint smell of baby powder returned. I broke into a cold sweat. I didn't turn on the light. Slowly, I walked to the bedroom, sat on the bed, and closed my eyes. I needed to gather my thoughts. But suddenly, something new happened. Not just a voice, not just a rustle. It was laughter. A high-pitched, childlike laugh, coming from just a couple of meters away from me. I jumped up, turned on the light, and looked around. There was no one in the apartment. But on the floor, right by the door, lay an old, worn-out child's ball. I couldn't remember ever seeing it before. I slowly picked up the ball. It was cold to the touch, as if someone had just held it. I stood there in complete silence, feeling the fear freeze me. At that moment, I realized I was no longer a guest in this apartment. I was an intruder, and someone didn't want me to stay here. The next night, everything got even worse. After that night, I couldn't find peace. Something in this apartment didn't just scare me. It wanted me to feel like an unwanted guest. But fear is a strange thing. It doesn't only paralyze you, it also sparks curiosity. I needed to know more. I decided to search the apartment thoroughly. I started with the furniture, then lifted the rugs and checked all the walls. At some point, I noticed that one of the walls in the hallway was slightly different from the others, as if it had been patched up again. Running my hand along it, I felt something strange. The wall was colder than the others. My heart began to race. I grabbed a hammer and started tapping the plaster. At some point, the sound changed. There was clearly an empty space behind the wall. I kept chipping away until a small hole formed. Looking inside, I saw a dark, narrow space and an old, dusty, half-destroyed toy. I pulled it out. It was a teddy bear, but its eyes were burned out, and the fabric was covered in something brown in places. I squeezed the toy in my hands, and at that moment I felt a whisper behind me. "Why did you open it?" The voice was soft, but distinctly childlike. I spun around sharply, but no one was there. Only the cold air, thick and heavy, filled the hallway. The light began to flicker. I backed away until I was in the room and slammed the door shut. That night, I didn't close my eyes. Now I knew. The walls of this apartment held secrets, and they didn't want me to uncover them. But leaving wasn't going to be so easy anymore. I woke up to silence, to that piercing, unnatural silence that presses against your ears, as if warning you, something has happened. The room was dark, with only the faint light from the street lamp casting a dull glow on the floor. I listened. No sound. But as soon as I turned my head toward the door, I saw it was slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered closing it, locking it, pressing it tightly shut. But now it was standing slightly open, as if someone had just peeked inside. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to breathe evenly. I got out of bed and approached the door, pausing in front of the gap. My heart was pounding. I slowly reached out my hand and pushed it. The hallway was empty. But now, something had changed in the apartment. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier, and somewhere deep within the apartment, I could hear a faint sound. A scratching, thin, persistent, like claws dragging across wood. I stepped forward. Each step echoed dully, as if there were more space in the apartment than there should have been. I walked toward the cupboard at the end of the hallway. The sound was coming from there. I slowly pulled the handle toward me. Creak and silence. The shelves were empty. Only dust. But as soon as I closed the door, I heard a soft sigh behind me. I turned around. On the floor, a few steps away from me, lay a child's doll. I hadn't seen it before. Its eyes were hollow, faded. The face was chipped. But the scariest thing, the corners of its mouth were twisted into a sinister, lifeless smile. I backed away, but then I heard a click. The front door closed by itself. and behind it someone was standing. I stood in complete silence, my heart pounding in my throat, and every breath felt heavy in my chest. I couldn't take my eyes off the doll, which now lay on the floor, as if waiting for me. The feeling that something invisible was watching my every move washed over me with renewed strength. Yet, instinct led me toward the door I needed to get out of there. With each step toward the entrance, I felt the air around me growing thicker, as though the space of the apartment itself was trying to hold me back. I reached the door, but the lock was jammed. I turned the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Someone was on the other side. Then I heard it again, the voice. That same child's voice I had been trying to ignore for all these days. "Are you leaving?" It sounded quiet and sad. I couldn't stay in this house anymore. I had to leave, and I wouldn't have believed it wasn't a dream if not for one small but terrifying detail. When I turned around, the doll was closer. Now it wasn't on the floor, but standing right by the door. Its smile had become even more sinister, as if it knew I was about to leave. "Please," the voice sounded again. "Don't leave." I froze. It felt like something was squeezing in my chest. I thought about leaving and how it would all end. But if I stayed, I might never leave alive. Suddenly I realized I couldn't leave it. That little voice, full of loneliness and fear, couldn't leave me indifferent. I turned around and said softly, but firmly, "I'm here. I hear you." And as soon as those words left my lips, silence filled the room. The entire house froze. The doll disappeared again. I felt something change behind the door. The silence, as if all sounds had vanished, was replaced by a cold that gripped my bones. Then, with a soft click, the door swung open. A shadow stood in the doorway. But it wasn't a threat. It was a child. A small boy. The one I had seen in my nightmares. But now his face was calm. His eyes weren't filled with fear, but rather with quiet anticipation. He said one word before disappearing. "Thank you." And at that moment I realized that in this house, despite all its eerie atmosphere, there was something more, not just spirits and ghosts, but a soul in despair, seeking peace. I left. I walked out, leaving the doll and the memories of the house behind. I never heard that voice again, but sometimes at night, when there is total silence, I feel like I still hear a child's laughter, hidden somewhere in the dark, and I know that he's not alone anymore.